Episode 2b, Orson Pratt, the prophet that never was. What if the course of Mormon history had taken a different turn? What if, instead of Brigham Young, the mantle of leadership had fallen on the shoulders of Orson Pratt, the restless mathematician, theologian, and rebel of the early church? Pratt was no ordinary apostle. He was the intellectual backbone of Mormonism, the man who systematized its theology, spread its message across the Atlantic, and preserved its scriptures in print. And yet, for all his brilliance and loyalty, Orson Pratt was never trusted with the ultimate role of prophet. Why? Because Pratt clashed with Brigham Young at nearly every step over doctrine, authority, and even the very nature of God. While Brigham wielded power through charisma and iron-fisted control, Pratt fought with logic, pamphlets, and relentless argument. In the end, history favored Young, leaving Pratt a tragic figure, indispensable yet sidelined. This is the story of the prophet that never was, Orson Pratt. Part 1. Pratt's early role. When we think about the early days of Mormonism, the name Orson Pratt doesn't usually rise to the top. But without Pratt, the religion might never have gained the intellectual backbone it needed to survive. Born in 1811 in Hartford, New York, Orson Pratt was only 19 years old when he encountered the fledgling movement. His brother Parley P. Pratt had already joined Joseph Smith, and in September 1830, Orson himself was baptized by Smith in Canaan, New York, one of the very first converts outside the Smith family circle. From that moment on, Pratt dedicated his life to the cause. Immediately after baptism, Joseph sent Orson on missions. By the time he was 20, he was traveling across the American frontier preaching Mormonism. Pratt proved himself not only tireless but persuasive. Within just a few years, he had brought hundreds into the church. His early missionary efforts in the eastern states built credibility for the new faith at a time when it was dismissed as a strange backwoods cult. In 1835, at only 23 years old, Orson Pratt was ordained an apostle, one of the original 12 chosen to lead the church under Joseph Smith. This placed him in the very top ranks of the movement. He was, by every measure, one of Joseph's most trusted men. But what truly set Pratt apart wasn't just his faithfulness, it was his mind. While Joseph was the visionary and Brigham Young the organizer, Orson Pratt became the thinker. He absorbed mathematics, philosophy, and science, and he brought that intellectual energy to Mormon theology. He began publishing pamphlets and tracts that would spread Mormonism far beyond American borders. His most important work came during his mission to Great Britain in the 1840s. While Brigham Young and others oversaw the British mission, it was Pratt's pen that gave Mormonism credibility. He published an interesting account of several remarkable visions in 1840, one of the earliest printed accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision. This little pamphlet would go on to shape how millions came to understand Mormon origins. And it didn't stop there. Pratt systematized Mormon doctrine in ways Joseph himself never had. Where Joseph relied on revelation and charisma, Pratt put ideas into print, tracts like Divine Authority and Absurdities of Immaterialism. He gave Mormonism an intellectual framework, making it look less like a frontier cult and more like a religion that could stand against Protestant theology and even modern science. By the time Joseph Smith was killed in 1844, Orson Pratt was already a towering figure in the church, a missionary, a pamphleteer, an apostle, and a theologian. In almost any other religious movement, he might have been seen as a natural successor. But history took a very different turn. Part 2, the succession crisis of 1844. On June 27, 1844, Joseph Smith was killed in Carthage jail. His death left a gaping void in leadership, and the young church immediately fractured under the weight of succession claims. Sidney Rigdon, Joseph's longtime counselor, declared that he alone should serve as guardian of the church. James Strang, a relatively new convert, produced a letter he claimed Joseph had written appointing him as successor. William Smith, Joseph's own brother, claimed the prophetic mantle by blood right, and behind them stood dozens of splinter groups, each insisting they carried the true torch of Mormonism. Amid this chaos stood Orson Pratt. By 1844, he was one of the most experienced and traveled apostles, a man who had given nearly 15 years of his life to Joseph's cause. He had preached Mormonism across the United States, in Canada, and in Britain. His tracks had spread Joseph's visions and revelations farther than any other early leader. If loyalty, experience, and intellect were qualifications for prophetic leadership, Orson Pratt had them in abundance. But Pratt never truly stood a chance, and the reason was Brigham Young. When Joseph died, Brigham was quick to claim that the Quorum of the 12 collectively held the right to lead. On August 8, 1844, Young gave the now famous Transfiguration speech, where some later swore he took on Joseph's voice and appearance, cementing his authority. From that moment, Brigham was the de facto leader of the church, and Orson Pratt, like the other apostles, fell in line. Yet behind the scenes, Brigham was already maneuvering to ensure that Pratt could never rise above him. Pratt had once been among the most senior apostles, but a brief excommunication in 1842 had cost him dearly. When he was rebaptized later that year, his standing in seniority was permanently weakened, a technicality that would haunt him for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life, Orson Pratt would remain in the Quorum of the 12, but always under Brigham's thumb. When others fell away, Pratt stayed. When others splintered, Pratt remained loyal. But his loyalty came at a cost. He was indispensable enough to keep close, yet dangerous enough to keep buried. The succession crisis was the moment when Orson Pratt might have stepped forward, but Brigham Young's iron grip and quick political maneuvers guaranteed that Pratt would never rise higher than an apostle. And that set the stage for the battles that would define the rest of Pratt's life, not against outsiders, but against Brigham Young himself. Part 3. Clashing Doctrines. Once Brigham Young had secured leadership, the church marched west. Young proved himself a capable colonizer, moving thousands of Latter-day Saints into the harsh deserts of Utah and carving out a new society. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and its center was Orson Pratt. Pratt was, by nature, a thinker. He believed that religion and science did not need to be enemies. He argued that God was infinite, that the universe was filled with unnumbered worlds, and that divine truth could be approached rationally. His writings show a man who wanted Mormonism to be not just a faith of obedience, but a faith of reason. Brigham Young could not have been more different. Where Pratt leaned on logic, Brigham relied on authority. Where Pratt welcomed science, Brigham distrusted it. And where Pratt systematized doctrine in print, Brigham preached raw, firebrand sermons that demanded loyalty first and foremost. The most explosive conflict came in the 1850s with the Adam-God doctrine. Brigham Young taught that Adam, the biblical first man, was actually God the Father in the flesh, the very being who had fathered Jesus Christ. To Young, this was revelation. To Orson Pratt, it was heresy. Pratt refused to endorse the teaching. He would not preach it. He would not defend it. He openly challenged Brigham in public settings, warning that such ideas could not be squared with Scripture or reason. In the Salt Lake Tabernacle itself, Brigham thundered that Orson Pratt was not fit for the company of God and angels. Pratt, undaunted, calmly defended his position, insisting that truth must withstand scrutiny, even if it came from the prophet himself. These weren't minor quarrels. They were open battles at the very heart of Mormon theology. Pratt's rational universe of infinite worlds stood in direct opposition to Brigham's authoritarian claim to new and shocking revelations. The clashes grew so severe that Brigham excommunicated Pratt, not once but twice. And yet, both times, Pratt was brought back. Why? Because the church couldn't afford to lose him. Pratt's writings, his pamphlets, and his intellect were too valuable. He was the one who gave Mormonism a veneer of credibility in the wider world. Brigham may have despised Pratt's independence, but he needed his pen. This uneasy truce defined their relationship for decades. Pratt, the loyal dissenter, never breaking away but never bowing fully to Brigham's demands. And Brigham, the iron-fisted ruler, keeping Pratt close enough to use but far enough down the ladder to silence. In any other church, a man of Pratt's stature, missionary, theologian, apostle, might have risen to the prophetic mantle. But under Brigham Young, his brilliance was a liability, not an asset. And so the question lingers, what if it had been Pratt, not Brigham, who took the reins in 1844? Part 4. The what-if scenario. History remembers Brigham Young as the great colonizer of the West, the man who led the Latter-day Saints across the plains and built a kingdom in the desert. But imagine for a moment that the mantle had fallen on Orson Pratt instead. How different might Mormonism look today? Pratt's leadership style would have been almost unrecognizable compared to Brigham's. For starters, Pratt was a man of ideas. He devoured mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, and he tried to make Mormonism fit into a rational, scientific worldview. In his writings, he described a universe teeming with endless worlds, each filled with God's creations. He argued against the traditional Christian notion of a God without body, parts, or passions, insisting instead on a material, knowable deity who worked through natural law. Under Pratt's leadership, Mormonism might have leaned into this rationalist framework. Instead of emphasizing obedience and hierarchy, it might have attracted intellectuals, scientists, and thinkers looking for a faith that could stand side by side with reason. Imagine a Mormonism that embraced astronomy instead of shunning it, that courted debate instead of suppressing it. But there's another side to the coin. Pratt was brilliant, yes, but also rigid. He clung tightly to logic and consistency, sometimes to the point of alienating those around him. While Brigham Young's charisma and sheer willpower could hold a fractured movement together, Pratt might have fractured it further. His insistence on reason could have clashed not just with Brigham, but with the rank-and-file saints who wanted clear direction and firm leadership in the chaos after Joseph's death. Would Pratt have had the raw authority to march tens of thousands of followers into an unforgiving desert and keep them there? Would he have commanded enough loyalty to enforce unity when rival claimants like Strang and Rigdon were pulling people away? It's far from certain. So we're left with a paradox. Under Brigham Young, Mormonism survived, but at the cost of becoming authoritarian, insular, and hostile to dissent. Under Orson Pratt, Mormonism might have embraced reason and science, or it might have collapsed entirely under the weight of intellectual debate and fragile leadership. What we know for certain is this: Pratt's vision of Mormonism was never allowed to flourish. Brigham buried him in apostolic seniority, silenced his public dissent, and repeatedly threatened him with excommunication. The intellectual prophet never got his chance, and so we return to the haunting question: what if Orson Pratt, not Brigham Young, had led the saints west? Would Mormonism be a faith of reason, or would it have died in the ashes of Nauvoo? Part 5. The Tragic Legacy. By the time the saints were firmly planted in Utah, Orson Pratt had become a paradox within Mormonism. He was indispensable, yet expendable, revered for his missionary work, pamphlets, and intellect, yet distrusted by Brigham Young, who saw him as a threat rather than a partner. Pratt never stopped contributing. He preached, he debated, he wrote. In 1879, near the end of his life, he oversaw the most important edition of the Book of Mormon since its first printing, dividing it into the chapters and verses still used today, adding footnotes and references that standardized the text. In many ways, he was the church's librarian, philosopher, and apologist all in one. But when it came to power, Orson Pratt was permanently sidelined. And that was no accident. Brigham Young made sure Pratt was buried in the line of succession. The brief excommunication in 1842 had reset his seniority, and Young never allowed it to be restored. This was the nail in the coffin. Pratt had been ordained before many of his peers, but Young's manipulation of seniority meant that when Brigham died in 1877, it was not Pratt who stood next in line. Instead, the presidency passed to John Taylor and later to Wilford Woodruff. By all rights, Pratt should have been there. He had been loyal since 1830, one of the earliest apostles, a man who had given nearly half a century to the cause. He had outlived Joseph, Hiram, and Brigham. In another world, Orson Pratt would have been the third president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But Brigham Young never intended to let that happen. He buried Pratt's chances decades earlier, stripping him of the seniority that would have made him prophet. Young silenced him in life and denied him the prophetic mantle in death. And so Orson Pratt became what history remembers him as, the prophet that never was, brilliant, faithful, and indispensable, yet deliberately denied the chance to lead. A man who should have stood in the prophetic line alongside Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, but instead was buried beneath it. I hope you learned something new. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and follow for more no-fluff, ex-Mormon content that cuts through the faith-promoting fog. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.